Right, so to reiterate, this evening I'm just going to be going over the last 6 of Paul's letters to churches. So again, I kind of have been explaining how the New Testament is organized. It's not organized by date. You know, you don't get the first writings ever written first in line in the New Testament. You don't even get things ordered by author, you know, all of John's writings, then all of Paul's writings, then all of Luke's writings. You don't get it ordered by author. I haven't studied too much about specifically why it's ordered the way it is. But there's definitely the 5 historical books that we went over and finished last week. We finished up the historical books. We've got the 4 Gospels, then you've got Acts, which is just a history of the first 30 some years of the Christian church. And then after Acts is all of Paul's writings. So all of his writings are in a chunk in the New Testament. And the first, let's see, 3 plus 6 plus first 13, or sorry, the first 7 are letters. No, I'm sorry. The first 9 are letters of Paul to churches. So 5 books of history ends. All of a sudden now when you're flipping through the New Testament, now you've got Paul's writings, and you're going to get 9 letters to churches. And I think they say in general that's just kind of ordered by length. It just starts with the longest one and it goes down to the shortest one. And then after those 9 letters, then you get 4 letters just from Paul to individuals, not to churches, to a single person. So there's 4 of those, and that's probably what I'll do next week. That would be coming next. So this is just finishing up Paul's letters to churches.
Cool.
The next one in line, we left off with, I believe we left off with 2 Corinthians. And the next one in line is Galatians. So Galatians, like I mentioned, is a letter to Paul. Now, of course, part of this study is we're examining in further detail those authors. You know, it's until we really dig in, we'll just say like they're ascribed to Paul. We can say that until we really talk about the author, and I can confirm or deny whether it's reasonable to think that that's written by Paul. But Galatians, in my studies, is everyone agrees it was written by Paul. And again, this is a letter to a church. It's a very theological letter to a church. I mentioned in the last presentation that different epistles have kind of different flavors. Some are a bit more theological, some are a bit more personal. Galatians is very much theological. And it was written, interestingly, I don't have so much a range as far as the dates it was written. I pretty much have an either or. It was either written in 50 to 51, or it was written in 57 to 58. One of those two. Then we'll get into that later here. But so this is a theological epistle. It's very much tied, people think, to the book of Romans. It's kind of got that flavor. It's they say, Romans is kind of Paul's crown jewel of a theological presentation. Yeah. He really is systematic. I think it seems like the general consensus is then Galatians is kind of the second, gets the silver medal, basically. It does have some of that very theological flavor. So it's very much tied to Romans in how sophisticated it is. It's a little less personal, and he's just kind of doing a lot more teaching in it. So it's really three main sections, if I'm just to give a summary of Galatians. The first thing he does, he starts out with a defense of his apostleship. So just what that means is he's again, he was the last apostle to join the apostles. And some people thought, well, maybe you don't really have a right to teach us And we kind of want to do our own thing. Who are you? This sort of thing. We saw some of this with the Corinthians. He had to battle some of that with the Corinthians. So he starts off his letter defending his apostleship. And the second thing he does is he really lays into some false teachings. And these false teachings, they definitely seem like what we would call Judaizers, or just in early Christianity, there were certain strains of teaching that basically wanted to hold Christianity down, the things that were being taught, to basically just reduce it to a form of Judaism. We still, Jesus didn't change much. He sort of gave us some new teachings and sort of things to think about, but we still need to be Jews in every sense of the term. Nothing foundational needs to change. He was really laying into this idea and attacking it, and along with that idea of keeping that Jewish way was this idea that that we need to follow the law. So the Jews had a religious law, hundreds and hundreds of rules that they needed to follow, and things like that. Getting circumcised was a big hot topic of this time. Do Christians need to be circumcised? We needed to when we were Jews. So he's really laying into the fact that they're not understanding what Jesus came to do and to fulfill that law. Jesus fulfilled that law. So the second point here that he's making, he's attacking these false teachings, and in doing so, he ends up presenting this really clear picture of how to acquire salvation, basically the Christian idea of being saved, and that it's by faith alone. So it's in total contrast to these false teachers that were popping up in Galatia. He's saying that's not the way, this is the way, and it's salvation by faith alone. So that's what he does for a good chunk, and so you can imagine it's very theological. He's attacking false beliefs, and he's presenting in place of that a true understanding of according to him and the apostles, what Jesus came to do, and how that relates to salvation. And the theme there is that it's by faith alone. And then the last part of that letter, he warns against abusing that freedom. So he doesn't just say, you don't have to do any of the strict religious rules and regulations. It's all a free gift. Salvation is given to you. Just believe in God, believe in what Jesus did, and you're good to go. He follows it up immediately at the end of Galatians with saying, don't abuse that freedom. Your freedom isn't given to you to go and keep sinning. Your freedom from these your freedom from working for God's graces is not given to you to go and continue sinning. It's to work righteousness, do righteous things with that freedom. So that's how he ends his letter to the Galatians. So going back to just the authorship of Galatians, like I mentioned, it's Paul, and the idea is that it's, in all my studies, it's people say it's unanimous that historians have considered Galatians to be written by Paul. It sounds like Paul, and importantly, it's quoted by early figures of the church. So I want to get into just real briefly a little bit more about what that means. So some of these books are quoted by the early church fathers. Some of them are referenced by the early church fathers. Some of them are merely included in lists. An early church father, someone will say, here's a list of all the books, and it's included in there. So we have these different ways that the early church fathers can give us help in understanding these books. And it isn't always church fathers. Sometimes we just get really, really early historians, in the first century or in the second century. So it's not always like church fathers, but a lot of times, naturally, because these books are important to Christians, you're getting these Christians very early on that are referring to these things, and they are reliable sources of information. They're not just wackos out there. So Galatians specifically, just an example to, because a lot of these books, I'll say that well, they think this was Paul because of the early figures of the church said so. So just as an example of kind of what that means, so Galatians was quoted by Polycarp, this guy named Polycarp, and to give anyone watching this an idea of kind of the history here. So this guy Polycarp, he was you could call him the disciple or the sort of student of John the Apostle, the guy who wrote the Gospel of John, the guy who wrote Revelation, the guy who wrote a couple epistles we'll be looking at later, who lived with Jesus, who was, very special to Jesus, one of the special apostles. There's a guy named Polycarp who's not in the New Testament. He's not, didn't write anything that we consider scripture, but he became a pretty important guy around the church circles, and he's written some stuff that we now still have, and he's been referenced by other people. And so this guy knew John, who knew Jesus. This guy may have known Jesus. I mean, we don't know that. We do know he knew John, who knew Jesus. I mean, this is like, it's just kind of crazy to think,
Yeah.
It's just kind of, it really puts, it's so many people think that, this book, this Bible is just in a world of its own. It's in its own bubble, and it's sort of severed from history. It just kind of descended, from the heavens, and here it is. But it's like, no, we know we've got other writings outside of the Bible from people who knew these guys writing the Bible. I mean, they're real people in real history. And so it's not that hard to really look at some of the people who knew these guys and go, well, yeah, they said that it was written by that guy, and they would know, and the people that know them would certainly know, and if they got it wrong, then someone would speak up and say something. So it's just pretty easy to look at history and go, well, we can come to a reasonable conclusion about who wrote this stuff and roughly when, because it's history, and we have a lot of writing from this time back and forth. And so just wanted to add a little bit, because from now on I'll probably just say people like that were agreeing that this letter was written by so and so, and to that just take it.
And I like the detail, but not everybody would.
Right.
But if you say it once,
yeah,
that gives it credibility.
It's
and
like,
you say,
wow.
Now, the other one is similar, all the way down the road. There are people that have quoted this or talked about it outside the Bible.
Right.
Or even in the Bible.
Yeah, and it's not always going to be the same folks. Sometimes it will be, not Polycarp, but it'll be Ignatius, or it'll be Irenaeus, or it'll be all three. And it's not always all of them, but it's just often the case that we get these types of references and things like that. So anyway, as far as Galatians, those are the reasonings I came to that Paul wrote it. And the dating, again, they kind of base it on his travels. They put it together with Acts and see kind of where he was at and for how long, and decide that way roughly the time frame. So going back to why there's these two options, it's either 50 to 51 or it was written in 57 to 58. Which, is it a big deal? know. We know roughly the decade it was written in, but it's kind of an interesting problem for dating, because there were sort of these two areas in the Roman Empire that were called Galatia, or that the people in that area were called Galatians. There's an area in the north, and there's also an area in the south.
I know that.
Excuse me. And I can't remember exactly why, if one of those areas was like completely destroyed by 57 or 58. And so it's like if he was written to, the one area, then it would have been the earlier time, because that area didn't exist at the later time, something like that. So it kind of depends on who he was writing to. And I think probably, there's one more point that people bring up, which is there's quite a few verses there at the beginning where Paul rehashes an event in which he went and he visited with lots of the apostles, and they had certain conversation, things like that. And it sounds a darn lot like what's called the Jerusalem Council, which is this meeting of all the head honchos of, early Christianity, all the guys who knew Jesus, got together and decided a couple really, really big, important things. And that meeting is recorded in Acts. And so now Paul is saying something here in the letter of Galatians. It sounds like he's telling them about that meeting. And if so, then that meeting would have already had to take place by the time he wrote Galatians.
Yeah. And
so I think you're probably looking at that later date. So this is kind of like how, historians of the New Testament think about these things, is they just kind of got to go, well, I suppose it depends on if you think he's talking about that same scene there in Acts or not. Yeah. And so I think it's fine to just say, well, it was written in the 50s. So that's Galatians. Oh, and then I just want to say one last thing, a little note about Galatians. I think this is the first letter we've come across so far where he ends the letter in his own handwriting, which is really interesting. It maybe indicates an attempt to sort of stop or prevent people from plagiarizing. At least he's aware that, and it could be totally something else. It could just be, when I was a property manager of apartment communities, I would make it a point to sign the letters that I would put out to people, just because it was a personal touch. It could totally be that. But it's kind of funny. And he does this with a lot of letters. I won't point out every single letter he does it with, but I think this is the first one that he did so far that we've gone over. So it's just kind of interesting that he'll write this, and then kind of near the end, maybe the actual sort of person who's got the pen to the paper, he'll say, and I so-and-so greet you and say hello. And then Paul will say, and I, Paul, in my own handwriting now greet you, see what large letters I write in. They think maybe he had a vision issue or something, which is maybe why he was always kind of referring to his very large letters. So he does that in quite a few letters, which is just, again, interesting, and puts kind of some flesh on the history that he's signing some of these in his own handwriting. So, but not all of them. So that's Galatians. Next up in line in the New Testament is Ephesians. Now, Ephesians, again, was written by Paul. This one's 60 to 62, they say, somewhere in there. And this is, again, an epistle to a church. It's of kind of a general flavor, not really theological, not really personal. We'll get into a little bit more of why that is. But most of these books, I think all but one of these 6 books I'm going over tonight, I read this week. I just read them over again. And when I got to Ephesians, it was such a breath of fresh air, because Paul's been nasty with the Corinthians. He's been nasty with the Galatians about their false beliefs and teachings and things like that. All of a sudden you get to Ephesians and he's just nothing but warm and positive. And I mean, you'd think these guys are doing everything right. Really, when you read Ephesians, he is just, and it's just wonderful. It's like, wow, great. They weren't all messing up. Right. There was some Christians that were really getting it right. so it's really got a positive tone. And the summary is it's, when I was reading it, I was like, I don't really know what he's doing with this. And I read some, of course, some different encyclopedia and dictionary entries and things, and people would just kind of say, well, he's just sort of presenting basic concepts of the faith. He's just sort of taking joy in the fact that they are keeping in the faith. And so as he's expressing that joy, he's kind of just reiterating, wow, I'm so great, I'm so grateful that, you guys recognize this, and that about, just kind of the faith. So just giving basic concepts. And in that, you definitely get, if I would say one sort of teaching theme in there is he's really talking about redemption and what Jesus accomplished. So isn't it great that we've been redeemed, and that, because Jesus did X, Y, and Z, he redeemed us and sort of secured our redemption. How cool, kind of thing. So that's you do get a little bit of some great information about kind of what Paul thinks about redemption.
Sure.
And he ends it with some ethical imperatives, is what I have written. He just ends it by telling them, keep doing this, keep doing that, make sure you do this. So I believe this is the one where he talks about marriage for a good chunk. Let me turn there really fast here. Yes. So he goes on for a good chunk of verses and really talks about marriage. I think this is certainly one of, if not the place, this is one of the places, if I were studying marriage and even just the family unit, I would go to Ephesians. So that's part of his ethical teaching there at the end. And by this point, I've realized there's sort of a pattern in these letters of Paul where he'll give teaching, he'll give information, he'll give maybe theology, and then he'll end his letter with, now do this, that, and the other. He'll teach, and then he'll command. So think about here is where I realized that pattern. So that's Ephesians. It's short, they're getting shorter as we're going through the letters to the churches. They're getting shorter. And then just as far as authorship, just again, those early church fathers were saying that this was indeed Paul, and we took it as Paul. So that's how we can know it was Paul. The dating, we get a couple letters where they say, well, it depends on, he's clearly writing from prison. So some of these letters he's writing from prison, and he'll say something to that effect. But the guy got imprisoned a lot. And so some of the dating kind of depends. It's like, well, it's clear by his letter he's in prison, not really clear which of the imprisonments he was in. But the fact that he was in prison helps to narrow it, the dating down there. And again, it just sounds like Paul. It sounds like him. Sounds like the stuff that he would say. So one interesting note about Ephesians would be good to know, I think, for especially Christians, is it's thought by a lot of people that the Ephesians was not written specifically to the Ephesians. A lot of people think it was originally just a very general letter, where at the very beginning where it says, hello, Church of Ephesus, that originally it just had said, hello, Church of blank, and you'd pen in whatever church that you wanted to give this to. And they think that because there's some early manuscripts that do have just a blank. Instead of Ephesians, it says hello blank. It's just got a blank, almost like a fill in the blank there. And this letter is very void of any personal addresses. There's some, but not nearly as many. Usually he just litters it, especially at the end, with this person says hello, and tell that other person that you guys have over there, tell them hello, and even like, hey, make sure to get a bed ready for Jimbo. He'll be visiting, in a few weeks. Ephesians doesn't have really any of that. It just kind of mentions the guy who would be presenting the letter. It mentions him and says, you know, we want to know your doings, and we wrote this letter so you'd know our doings. So it's very brief on that personal stuff. And, you know, like I mentioned, it's kind of a general epistle, just sort of the basic concepts of the faith. So the genre might fit with something like that. Of course, we don't know. You know, reading it's tough to read. I think for one, it's a new idea. We don't have really any precedents for that. We don't really have any other correspondence in the New Testament that functioned that way. Yeah. So it's kind of like, well, maybe, you know, it's like one of those things where, yeah, that might be the case, but you know, that'd be different. That would definitely be different. And then there's also there are some things in there, I can't remember where, but there's a few things where I just think, well, that'd be really odd of him to say in a general letter that's just multi-purpose to any church. He does make some kind of specific references, you know, like, you guys have been doing really great on this, that, and the
other. That would go
just
good with Galatians.
Yeah, that wouldn't. Yeah, you wouldn't want that letter going to the Galatians, and so, you know, I think, you know, I lean more towards it was probably specifically to the Ephesians, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a guy. So, oh gosh, and then Philippians comes next. So Philippians is written again by Paul as a more personal epistle to the church in Philippi. They say 61 to 63, somewhere in there. So around the same time as Ephesians, maybe shortly after. Philippians, again, breath of fresh air. Is very warm and positive. It's great. I mean, he's happy with the church. Really, my notes, I broke it down into 3 parts. Originally, it just said part 1. He said, keep on keeping on, Philippians. Part 2, warning against false teachers. And part 3, keep on keeping on. That's basically what it does. Is good job, guys, and careful of the false teachers. And good job, guys. See you later. You know, is really what he's doing. So I thought, well, okay, what does keep on keeping on mean? And so really in the first part, the theme, other than I'm so happy you guys are doing great, you know, you're really living the faith. The theme was Christian unity. Was we really should be all of one mind. I'm happy that you guys are all of one mind. This is really cool to see just the unity, that we're not divided amongst ourselves. You know, you guys are doing great. So the theme there is unity. And then again, he jumps in and he warns against false teachings, and not super clear, you know, because you could put names on different types of false teachings. And so people wonder, well, are these the Judaizers or are these the Gnostics? You know, who are these false teachers? And, you know, it's not clear, but he does say what the false teachings are. You know, here's the things that are wrong. You know, those are just wrong ways of thinking about what Jesus has done. And so he doesn't do it in a way of like, you guys have embraced that, but just kind of almost like a, don't be like the Galatians, don't be like the Corinthians, you know, please, you know, keep on keeping on, stay away from these false teachings, and give some examples of false teachings. Ends it again with, you know, you guys are doing great. And he really spends a lot of verses actually just thanking them for a gift that they had made to him. They must have helped support him on some sort of mission. He actually says, you guys are the only ones. You guys are the only church who's given me anything. You know, of course he says, not that I need anything. I can live on nothing. I'm in prison. You know, I'm fine. But boy, it was nice to eat, you know, for those couple of weeks or that, whatever, you know. He's really just like, thank you guys for that gift. And so super warm letter and a personal letter. Like I said, it's very personal. He's just got some things he wants to tell them specifically. So the authorship, this is one I actually quoted just to give people an idea of when I'm going through and I'm studying and I'm looking at different encyclopedia entries and things like that, the type of thing that these guys will just kind of blanket give a blanket statement. This quote from one of the encyclopedias here was, the authenticity is solidly attested by antiquity and almost unanimously accepted by modern scholars. So you get phrases like that, just sort of like, okay, I mean, that's fine enough with me. I read that, 6 times in 6 different good sourced areas. Then I go, I don't have any real reason to buck against that. And then another quote from, I think, a different source is, they just say that the terminology in theology are thoroughly Pauline, just meaning it sounds a lot like Paul. It really is just very much like Paul. So that's why we think it's Paul. And then again, the dating, we know he's in prison. Just kind of depends which imprisonment we're talking about. So next in line is the Book of Colossians. This is Paul's letter to the Colossians. This range of dating, it's a little more broad, 57 to 64, somewhere in there. Colossians, when I read it, I thought, this sounds so familiar. Because like I said, I read almost all these books this week. And I got to Colossians, like, I've read this somewhere, and I flip back, and then like it's Ephesians. It's it's Ephesians. It's almost exactly like it. And I'm not particularly outstanding in that realization, because as I did my studies, everyone else sort of realized that too. It resembles Ephesians a lot. It very much does. So maybe the unique thing is he goes a little bit more into what's called Christology, which is just a fancy word for teachings on the nature of Jesus. Who is Jesus? What is he? Sort of thing. What's his place in the universe? Where does he stack up? Is Christology. And so he definitely gives a lot of good information on Christology. And he, in the second part, he calls the Colossians, he calls them to freedom. And he kind of does that same thing that he's been doing in all these letters, where he's basically saying, don't believe these false teachings that sort of chain you down and make you a slave to your work and your righteousness. Embrace the freedom that we have in Jesus and cling to that. Cling to that freedom. You don't need to do this, that, and the other to be saved. You just need to believe and have faith and cling to Jesus is what you need to do. And so that's what he's doing here in the second part of Colossians. And then again, true to form, he closes it off with some commandments, some ethical commandments. Do this, that, don't do X, Y, or Z. That's how he closes it off. I always love those sections. I wish there was more sections like that, honestly. In the New Testament, because you just love when they just say, here, Christians, this is how you should be living. These are the things you should be doing. These are the things you shouldn't be doing. Those are always great. So it's always good to know where to find those nuggets.
Sure.
So the authorship of Colossians is kind of a fun one. So one of my sources said the genuineness of this book is not called into question. No one questions it. But there was another source that said, well, some people, they do now. Starting in the mid-19th century, it started to be questioned. Whereas it hasn't for the majority of all of history since the writing of these, it hasn't. But now people are looking at it and they're thinking, well, the false teachings Paul's referring to in this book sound kind of like Gnosticism. which was just a heresy, a religion that drew some concepts from Christianity, but was ultimately
pagan, wasn't it?
A totally different foundation. What's that?
Wasn't it kind of pagan?
Oh yeah. It was very pagan philosophy mixed with sort of Christian terminology and things like that. So they thought, well, it sounds like he's kind of referring to Gnosticism. And if he was, then Gnosticism didn't really take off until like the 90s, and Paul died before the 90s. So if Paul's writing about Gnosticism, then Paul can't be Paul. This had to have been somewhere else. Is kind of what they're saying, and that's fine. I'm not saying that's possible. That's possible. But it just seems to me, and to the majority of the studies that I've done, it doesn't seem like a quite strong enough argument, to tear down, a couple thousand years of understanding this letter to be Paul.
Sure.
Because it could be Gnosticism or it could be not. It's not
specific enough.
All specific enough. Not at all. It's really quite vague. And in addition, Gnosticism was at its height in the 90s, but it had to have come from somewhere, and so naturally, decades before, it was probably starting to take form. Those types of ideas were starting to take form, and so it's not unreasonable to think, well, maybe he's addressing some form of early Gnostic type ideas. It's just, we just don't know, and so it's just not quite enough to really say, well, that's not Paul. It's like, it's an interesting thing to kind of point out and think about, but I'm not so sure that we can bank on that. And one other thing that is mentioned in doubting whether it's Paul is people say, well, there's some differences in the style and the vocabulary. And okay, I suppose if you think, people can't use different styles or different vocabulary, that
it depends on who he's writing to too. Probably.
Yeah. And again, maybe, well, this is just too far off from what Paul could have possibly written. This isn't Paul. It just doesn't sound like him. But again, it's like he possibly, but probably more strongly, the possibility is that he just uses different words sometimes than he normally does, and kind of changes his style up. And I certainly write different to different audiences, and more than that, the section specifically that is pointed out that this kind of sounds a little bit different. He was addressing a very unique problem, and so it's sort of a issue he hasn't addressed before. So he changes up his style and the words he's using. It's just something to think about. But again, it's sort of just possibilities people have kind of thunk up when sort of reading through this, but it doesn't at all seem that the consensus is that that's strong enough reason to abandon the strong history that this is Paul writing. So so that's Colossians. Last two here are Paul's two letters to the Thessalonians, folks living in Thessalonica. These two letters, well, we'll just start with the first one. Is again, it's a very pleasant, positive letter. He opens right up with warm greetings and just expressing joy. That's really the first whole section, is just, I'm so glad you guys are keeping in the faith. We've suffered so much, and he's almost kind of like, I sort of expected you guys to just say with all this, Christianity stuff, because it's been tough. So great. I'm really glad to hear, you guys are still in it. That's cool. That was basically the first part of it. The second part, this is kind of unique to the two letters, the two Thessalonians letters, is he talks a lot about the Christians who've died already. He's
Oh, okay.
he's setting their minds at ease. Perhaps they've said something to Paul either in person or in a letter, or he's just kind of heard that they've been a little uncertain about, well, people are starting to die, and we've got this new world order basically that God sort of initiated with Jesus, and we're still kind of learning how that new world order goes. So but some people are dying, and there's been talk of eternal life and stuff like that, and kind of the kingdom of God. What happens to these guys? Are we still good? Is the game plan still on here, or what's going on? So the middle section of First Thessalonians is him just kind of saying, it's okay. The plan is still on. There's still eternal life. Jesus is still coming back. Nothing's changed. Don't worry about them. They are secure. They're good. Common word used in a lot of the New Testament is, those who've fallen asleep. They're sleeping.
Oh, right.
They're not dead. They're sleeping. So that's his middle part there. And then again, he ends it with a lot of great just ethical teachings. Just it's specifically, or I guess an example would be sexual relations. He gives them some teachings on sexual relations. A fun tidbit: I mentioned that I read 5 of these 6 epistles over this week preparing for this presentation. First Thessalonians is the one that I skipped.
Oh,
you want to know why?
Why?
Because early on in kind of meeting with my mentor, he assigned me to read First Thessalonians every day for 30 days for a month.
Wow.
And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to skip that one. I think I already have in my head what Paul said in that letter. So I did not reread that one in its entirety. But what really stuck with me in those 30 days when I was reading, and I still remember, is just his last section there where he gives his commands and his ethical teachings and things he wants them to do and to not do. One thing that always stuck with me at the very end is he tells them to do 3 things always, all the time. Do these 3 things. That's pretty big, to always have to do something. And the 3 things were always be prayerful, thankful, and now I'm gonna blank. Prayerful, thankful, and joyful.
Oh, yeah.
Always be those things. I was like, wow, that's big. And so that's just kind of the type of ethical teachings he gives, but that's just really, wow, I always have to be those things. Paul tells me to. So I mean, if you're a Christian anyway, it's that's something that you're gonna have to do. So those are the types of things he concludes with there. So it's kind of a combination. It's a personal epistle. It's also practical. He's kind of addressing something that seems like maybe they were concerned about. So but definitely more of the personal side, and written sometime between 51 and 54, probably in the middle there, maybe 52 or 53. So that's early. This is probably the first letter written by Paul. And not only that, it's interesting to think about this and to read this fact, but First Thessalonians is probably the first documentation we have of the religion of Christianity itself. It's probably the first thing we have written down about Christianity, about Jesus, about probably the very first thing we have actually written pen to paper. So it's very cool. And it's early 50s here, so we're talking less than 30 years from Jesus' death, or sorry, less than 20 years from Jesus' death. So 10 plus years after Paul's writing here. So it's very early. And as far as his authorship, very, very unanimous that it's Paul. There's no reasons against it. This letter is quoted by the early church fathers. and the dating is just based on the timeline of his ministry.
Yeah.
So just like First and Second Thessalonians, those two had the theme of you guys are really messing up in a lot of ways, not just false teachings, but just you're just acting fools, you're being unethical, notoriously so. And then he follows up in the second letter and says, thanks for improving. You know, those two are connected. Thessalonians, First and Second Thessalonians, are connected by that theme of the Christians who've died and what happens to Christians who've died. So it sounds like maybe they misunderstood something he wrote in First Thessalonians, or they didn't quite fully embrace what he was saying, or there's some lingering doubts or anxieties about what he was saying. So Second Thessalonians, he's following up on his teaching, or his yeah, I guess you could call it teaching, or his setting their minds at ease about that subject.
Reassuring them,
his reassurance on that subject. Thank you. He opens it up though again with, great job, guys. You're still doing great. Keep on keeping on. Love it. And then he gets into, I wrote down practical exhortations related to eschatology, which just means he's telling them to do stuff and to not do stuff related to the end of the world. So he's not just teaching them about the end of the world and stuff like that, but he's kind of saying, well, here's how you should live in light of what we know about the end of the world. And basically, if I could summarize, basically what he was saying is, keep doing keep living. Don't act like the world's going to end tomorrow, because we don't know that. We don't know that at all. You know, don't quit your jobs. Don't, stop working. There's definitely, it seems like there's people that were just like, they quit their jobs and they just were just kind of leaning back in lawn chairs, just chilling.
Just waiting, right?
And just waiting. And he's like, okay, you guys, I think you still didn't quite understand in that first letter I wrote to you. That's not what we're doing here. That's not what we're waiting for. And so he gets into that a bit, and it's very interesting to read. And that's pretty much it. That's all he does, is just keep rocking on, guys. And I really need you to kind of change your thinking and your actions as regards to the expectation of the end of the world. So very interesting read there. There's kind of nothing like it in such kind of down-to-earth, such a down-to-earth address about the end of the world, in the Christian canon here, because it's very, like I said, it's not very theological. It's very personal. He's just kind of talking about it, casually talking about the end of the world, and it was kind of cool to get his just sort of layman's take on the end of the world there. And so the authorship of Second Thessalonians is contested again. So kind of like Colossians, where this is one of those where the scholars nowadays go, well, I don't know if that's really Paul. But that's, again, a new development of kind of that same type of modern scholarship, just kind of thinking, well, if we look at this, then maybe we could at least spin a case for why it might be someone different. But generally, historically, it's always been accepted. It's been, again, quoted by church fathers, including Polycarp, so in fact, it's got some of the sources that I read said it's actually better attested than the first letter to the Thessalonians. Especially that quote from Polycarp. It's actually quoted by an early church father, which is like the best possible evidence you could have, is someone in the first century or so saying, quoting the book. So it already exists. They clearly think it's of incredibly high, spiritual value. So it's actually in a way better attested than the first, and yet it's kind of the one that's sometimes nitpicked to think, well, maybe it's someone else. But I take it to be Paul.